Hello, my name is Hannah Bankson, and I'm a junior in elementary education, also getting my learning technologies minor. For the CI 454 final flip chart, I chose to design a third grade level lesson on finding equivalent fractions by making them using similar fraction circles as well as placing them on the same point in the number line. This is in the mathematics, fractions, and numbers location of the Iowa Common Core. And as you are going through my flip chart, you can see on the first page I have just an overview of the fraction lesson. Actually, this is the second page. So it describes my content area, my subject area, the Iowa Core standard that I used, and note that I only used part of this Iowa Core standard. There was about 4 bullet points, and I narrowed it down to the 2 main things that I wanted to focus on specifically. And then I also included a technology standard because I will be expecting students to use a few different websites throughout my lesson. So moving on to the third page, I listed out my lesson objectives. One thing that I've been learning in several other of my CI courses is that, especially in mathematics, informing students up front about what they will be learning oftentimes allows them to grasp the concept better as they know what they're supposed to be doing and ultimately know what they're supposed to get out of the lesson. So then moving on to my fourth page, that is where we discuss, where we start diving into the learning. So I pose a question for my students on the first page that is, what is a fraction? I give students a dictionary.com reference that they can click on and spend about 3 minutes discussing with their neighbor what they think a fraction is based on the definition, and then coming up with some examples on their own. I definitely think anytime that you allow students to be responsible for their own learning and understanding, they are able to grasp the concept a little better, and discussing with a neighbor or a partner allows them to see if they're on the right track and build their ideas off of each other. So that's the first part of what their learning is. And then on the next slide, they will browse the internet using one of the interactive sites I found. It's hyperlinked in the PowerPoint. Ideally, I'm hoping that my students will be in a one-to-one school, so they will all have access to this flip chart on either their iPads or personal laptops, making it easier for them to click on the sites and do some of the activities that I have later in the presentation. But once they get to this site, they'll see that they have different areas for all mathematics. Obviously, for this lesson, I would like them to focus mainly on the fraction portion. So I have steps below for them to access the website. And then I put a guideline of looking at least 2 different sections of the fraction site so that students are kind of held accountable for their learning. So then after I have given students the opportunity to browse the internet, use their devices, share with neighbors, ask questions as necessary, hopefully they've developed a fairly good understanding of what a fraction is, and then furthermore what equivalent fractions are and how to go about finding those. That is something that we will work on a little bit deeper into the lesson, but as a head start, that's something that I wanted them to take responsibility and do. So that's kind of how I made the first portion of my presentation interactive. Then about midway through my lesson, I have a checking in point where students will use their active votes to answer the following questions. One thing that I really like about this is that the questions come in anonymous, so students they have the ability to share their honest opinion and where they feel like they're doing in the lesson. So the first question that I ask is, do you have a fairly good understanding of what a fraction is? And then I just ask for a blatant yes or no response. Based on what my students answer, that is how I will kind of gear the lesson moving forward. So if a lot of my students say yes, they feel like they have a fairly good understanding of what a fraction is, then I will continue on with my presentation. If the majority of students say, no, I think I need a little bit more help, then I know that I can gear my instruction and move back a little bit, and instead of just relying on the students to browse the internet, talk a little bit about it more in depth through whole group class discussions and stuff like that. And then the second question also helps me to even further decide how I'm going to shape the rest of my instruction by asking if they're ready to do some practice or if they would rather go back and discuss the concept a little bit more. So assuming that we have now understood what a fraction is and most of the students are understanding kind of the purpose of this lesson, we move on to the next page of the flip chart that says Learning Basic Fractions. Since fraction circles is a big portion of the lesson and part of the standard that the students are required to understand and develop, I have different fraction circles listed on the page. That's something that we will go over and talk about as a group, as well as have students come to the board and do some shading of, for example, another portion of 1/4 of the fraction circle or another portion of 1/8 of the fraction circle. So that makes the lesson a little bit more interactive too as students come up to the presentation board and do some of the work. So after they've learned some of the basic fractions, we move into the heart of the lesson, which is finding common denominators. This is another reason why I would hope that the school is one-to-one so that students have an opportunity writing out the equations for themselves. If that is not the case, then we will definitely pull students to the front to do the presentation on the Active Inspire board. But as you can see, I made an example there, converting 1/2 and 1/4 to find their equivalent fractions using sixteenths. And then I depicted what the fraction circle would look like, showing how in 1/2 it is the same as 8/16, which I think is a good representation for students to understand the concept. And then I did the same thing for 1/4 and 4/16. So the next slide is where my presentation has the heart of its interactivity because I used containers to have students come up and practice their calculations. So sometimes the containers haven't been working perfectly, but I tried my best, and right now they are staying where they're supposed to be staying. So obviously the 8/16 will go in the box above the 1/2 and the 1/4 will go in the second box to the left. So students will be able to come up and place those in their respective locations, getting some additional practice. And then lastly, I just check in again using the Active Inspire votes. I ask, how comfortable do you feel trying this on your own? And then they have 3 choices this time, whether they're feeling extremely comfortable, they could use a little more practice, or they're not comfortable at all. And then I ask if they want to do another example before the assessment, or if they think that they're ready to move on. And then once again, this will shape my further instruction. So for example, if the majority of students want to do another example, I would go up to the slide, finding common denominators, and we would do another example as a large group class. It's important to note that with all of these slides, students will be practicing and doing a lot of the learning in small groups using their own technological devices. So while the slides might not seem overly interactive at the beginning because I was unable to get the Spotlight tool to work only on one screen, it was giving me a little bit of difficulty. I really just used incorporating links and containers and the Active Inspire Active votes into my presentation. But I will be having a lot of students come up to the board and help me write, as well as having a lot of discussion between their classmates and myself to find out exactly how students are learning. So after that second check-in, and we've had time to practice a lot of the examples and the majority of students are feeling pretty confident with this lesson, we will move into the assessment. The assessment will be attached with the presentation in the Blackboard assignment. I couldn't get it to post in the flip chart, but that is a summative assessment that I have designed, and that will ideally tell me exactly how students are doing. So thank you so much for listening. I hope that this presentation was inclusive and a good lesson that you think could be adapted in a real classroom. I hope you enjoy the rest of your semester.